Kia ora tātou, grab your coffee and grab your seat. We'll get underway shortly. Thank you very much, and tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for joining us today. Alofalahi atu, alo elelei, alofalava, kia ora ana, nisambola venaka. As you can tell, I'm not Jude McCool. We have a slight change of plan. Jude unfortunately has some family issues, so she's down the line a bit. You have to make do with me. The upside of that is you don't have to listen to me rabbit on as one of the speakers. So I'm happy to welcome you all and to facilitate the conversation. We have two speakers today, and I'll introduce them in a minute. So again, thank you for joining us, and we have folk online as well. A couple of the acoustics in this Fale is not great. The Fale itself is beautiful, but the acoustics and the slides are not fantastic. So we traded a boring, old, cold, dull lecture theatre up the road for this beautiful Fale, but that's the downside is, as I say, the acoustics are not great, especially for old people with hard of hearing like me. So if you're going to ask a question, you need to speak up a bit later. So today we're here to discuss a really challenging topic. Distributive justice. I needed to kind of pause and think about what does it actually mean. That's the purpose of the conversation today. Social justice, for those of you who don't know, I'm a bit preoccupied with it. Social justice is a concept of fairness, equity, the distribution of resources, of opportunity, and rights within a society. I'm motivated for us to organize this conversation because I'm not sure that social justice and fairness is high in the minds of people who are governing us at the moment. And we need to continue to raise the flag, maintain the focus on these kinds of concerns, I suppose, that probably wouldn't occur to those who are making decisions at the moment. So social justice encompasses the idea that everyone deserves equal access to basic necessities and the chance to participate fully in social, economic, and political life, regardless of their background. Equity is the absence of unfair, avoidable, and preventable differences between different groups. Recognizing that people have different needs and circumstances and providing tailored support to ensure everyone has access to what they need to succeed. This contrasts with equality, which assumes everyone needs the same thing. And there are people who deliberately misuse the terms for their own purposes. The principles of equity, equality, and need are most relevant in the context of distributive justice, and Monique will talk to us more about that, but it plays a role, obviously, in a variety of social justice issues. The principles appeal to the notion, the idea that fair treatment is a matter of giving people. There is a New Zealand Medical Journal This goes to the issue of need. New Zealand Medical Journal editorial by Belinda Loring, Paparangi Reid, and others came out earlier this year. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. This business of we should be pushing need, not race. You've heard this expressed. But as they point out in that article, ethnicity is a superior. It's better than many markers of need that we know of. I do recommend the paper. And targeting by ethnicity, evidence-based, and leads to better allocation of resources. So with those few remarks, we're fortunate to have two distinguished speakers today. Our first speaker is our colleague from the faculty, Associate Professor Monique Jonas. Monique is an Associate Professor of Ethics and Head of Health Systems at the School of Population Health at Waipapa, Taumata, the University of Auckland. She has a doctorate in medical ethics from King's College London, and her research spans a wide range of ethical concerns connected with health, decision-making, and the relationship between the family and the state. She teaches ethics within the medical program and the Bachelor of Health Sciences, and has served on New Zealand's National Health Committee, the National Ethics Advisory Committee, and Health Research Council Ethics Committee. So we'll hear from Monique, and take some questions after that, and then I'll introduce our second speaker, Rob Campbell. Welcome, Monique.
Kia ora ana. It's lovely to be here. Thank you very much, Sir Colin, for providing this opportunity, and to your amazing team for facilitating everything as beautifully as you always do. It's a real pleasure for me to speak a little bit about one of my really early interests when I was first being trained. And you know, being at the School of Population Health, I'm often doing philosophy that's connected really to practice, and it feels like a rare opportunity to talk about political philosophy in this way. And when Sir Colin and I were talking about what this might be, I started talking about the equity adjuster, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But Sir Colin was like, less on the tools, more on the principles, which was astonishing to me. And now I feel worried about whether I'm going to fulfill the bill, because I'm taking an approach like with Italian cooking. You know, Italian cooking, you don't use 30, you know, this isn't Yoshimo Telengi, you know, you're not using 30 ingredients, you're using like 3 or 4 beautiful ingredients and making something perfect from that. And that is the approach. I'm not aiming for perfection, but that is the approach of spareness, sort of theoretical humility that I'm using today. And the reason is because I believe, you know, distributive justice is a team sport. We're all in this, we're affected, everyone is affected by it. And we all come with our positionality, and I don't think we get very far if we stick at the edges. We have to really think about the principles that sit right in the middle and what they ask of us. And I believe that we can get everywhere we need to be, pretty much, through principles that we can all agree with. It's just a matter of working out how to put them together, to get to a point that seems like it's truly just. So my task today is to give you a sense of how we can do this in a way that only uses principles that everyone agrees with. So you'll tell me. I'm relying on you to tell me whether I misstep here. So I am going to start with recent events. Well, fairly recent events now. Let's hope. Oh, look, I can make it work. So, you might remember in 2023, there was reporting of the equity adjuster tool. Now, actually, there were several tools that were designed, one down south and one at Te Poutoko Ora. But when this began, I think that we were still in DHB land because it was 2020. And the urology team at Auckland Hospital. So 2020, this is like peak COVID. So after the early lockdowns, the team at running the elective surgeries in urology recognised that there's very long-standing inequities in how long people were waiting for elective surgeries had only gotten worse over COVID. So that was very concerning, because if you just went back to running the list how you did, you would be baking in and increasing inequity between groups. And so the groups that were affected were people of Māori ethnicity, Pasifika, people living in rural communities, and people living in communities with higher socioeconomic deprivation. So this small team began thinking about how they might respond to this, and they came up with a plan to devise an algorithm which would modify the scores which have been used in New Zealand since the 1990s, the clinical priority assessment criteria scores that represent a measure of a candidate's clinical need. So you get this score, which essentially puts you into a priority category, and the intention was that there would be this marginal re-weighting for a number of different things. So how long you had spent waiting already, how long you were on the waiting list for, Māori ethnicity, Pacific ethnicity, socioeconomic deprivation in terms of your domicile, where you lived, and if you were in a non-metro location. So the scores would be modified, and based on those adjusted scores, patients would be contacted to book an elective surgery. So that was where it was applied, at the point of booking in for surgery. So that kind of rumbled along for a few years, and then, for reasons that are mysterious to me, in 2023, it became a news event. So there were a few weeks of very highly politicised conversation about the ethics of equity adjustment. Now, this became a kind of political issue, and people split along party lines to a significant extent. And it would be very easy for us to descend into political sniping here. But I think it's a mistake to do that, because there are genuine ethical issues that I think require some pretty careful thought here, and everybody, I think, needs to do that. So, what I'm going to do now is lay out the stances as I see them. So what we really need to be thinking about, because it's interesting what was picked up in the debate. As you'll see, the adjuster had a number of targets, but the only target for criticism was ethnicity. So I heard various people saying, oh, it's fine to adjust for rurality and for deprivation. The issue is ethnicity. And so we can lay out the kind of rough positions that people took here. So the question that really held the political attention was whether it was just to prioritise with reference to ethnicity. And the two positions that were laid out looked a little bit like this. So on the one hand, there was a group of critics of equity adjustment, which held something like this. So determining a person's priority for receiving health care by reference to their ethnicity is to express a racialised preference. It's to express a preference for an ethnicity. And doing that, expressing a preference for one ethnicity over another, is racist. It's unjust. Why is it unjust? It's unjust because it offends against our inherent moral equality. Ethnicity does not mediate our moral standing. Our moral standing is not affected by ethnicity. So, prioritising between patients based upon ethnicity is racist, and it's wrong, and it should stop. And that is almost a verbatim quote from some of our leaders about the equity adjustment tool. So that's one position. And then on the other side, there is a position that goes a bit like this. So it's very convenient to edit out all the ways that ethnicity does, in fact, mediate our access to health. If we act like we are all and have equal standing in the system, then we bake in inequities that make it possible for some people to have their health needs met in a system that's responsive to them and acceptable to them and accepts them, and obstructs that for other people. So this is the kind of equity approach that Sir Colin was describing in his introduction. So here we have two positions. So one position that holds up an ideal, and this is an ideal I think we all sign on to. This is the problem. We all sign on to this ideal that we are all moral equals. We all have equal standing. So if you take that ideal and think about justice from the perspective of that ideal, so that justice means that you act according to that ideal, then it looks like equity adjustment is unfair, it's unjust. But if you take the stance that we live in a non-ideal world, so there's no point in pretending otherwise. So doing something just doesn't mean adhering to an ideal that is not expressed in the world around us. It means we try to deliver that ideal rather than trying to act according to an ideal that is in fact not present. So how do we navigate our way between these things? I think many people felt very caught about what their values required of them in this discussion. And it becomes tricky. Why does it become tricky? Well, it becomes tricky for several reasons. So firstly, there is a question here about distributive justice. And distributive justice is not something that is taught at schools. And fewer and fewer people do humanities and philosophy at university. Most people do not know much political philosophy. So you feel like you're having to take a position on something you don't have any grounding in, which is a scary thing. So that's the first reason. It feels hard to know where your position is or how to navigate through this. And the second is, you can be trained in political philosophy. I'm trained in political philosophy. And it's not necessarily that much help because political philosophers do not agree with each other about many things. So knowing the theory doesn't take you away from needing to commit yourself between opposing positions. So this is not like something like informed consent, where we have a pretty settled idea of what informed consent is, its components, and we have some case law. It's not like that. So it's much more inherently contestable. So those things make it hard. And then there's another reason why distributive justice is difficult. So on the one hand, it's this abstract thing that a reducing number of philosophers talk about in the world and not much else. But on the other hand, it's something that we all live and breathe from very early on. So I have children, I was a child, and one of the things that I'm endlessly fascinated by is how attuned tiny children are to distributions. It's like we are hardwired to work out who is getting the most here. So if you have ever, for instance, cut a cake when kids have been watching you, and then ask them to choose a slice, so before they know numbers, before they know that fractions exist, they can detect the biggest slice. And that is the slice that they want. And if they don't get that slice, if their brother gets that slice, how come he gets the biggest slice? So from very early on in our life, we are thinking about justice. We're thinking that unequal distributions stand in need of justification. So we think you have to give an explanation of this. If we are not all getting exactly the same, why not? And that justification has to be compelling to us. It has to be something that we accept and we feel fairly treated by. So distributive justice is both abstract and it's both highly personal. It's something we encounter from our very first experiences of being in groups. It's relational. It's about how we stand in relation to other people. It is about our material capacity, and it's what we can call rivalrous. So it puts us in competition with other people. So it is difficult in that way. So we bring all of this swirl of, oh God, I don't know anything about distributive justice, but I hate being treated unfairly, to this kind of kōrero about equity adjustment. And then within that debate, there is a whole lot of political agendas playing out. It's no wonder it became a bit messy. So what I am going to do is just take, because I think about this like a Jenga stack, you know, that is any moment it's going to topple down. And I'm just going to take one little block from that. And the little block that I'm going to take is this question, really. It's a question about whether it is okay to think about anything except for current health needs when we are choosing between candidates for a procedure. Because this was something that was spoken about in the debate. So, as Sir Colin said, it's like health needs. That's the only thing we can think about, health needs. What does a person need now? So justice requires us to consider that. So I'm going to focus on this, and to get to my end point, and my end point is that justice very often requires us to look beyond this current moment in order to reach a fair allocation. And that the place I'm going to start from, because this is the start, guys, so buckle in. Oh, my lordy, is Aristotle. So I'm not going to take you right through from Aristotle, so don't worry about that. But Aristotle's formal principle of justice is extremely helpful for giving us a framework for thinking about what justice is. So this principle says justice requires that equals are treated equally and unequals are treated unequally in proportion to their relevant inequalities. So this is called a formal principle because it provides us with the form of justice. So what justice looks like is like cases are treated alike and unalike cases are treated unalike, proportionately unalike. So you can see here, for those of you who work in the health research field, you can see the seeds of horizontal equity and vertical equity here in Aristotle's formulation. So it gives us the form. We need to treat like cases like, but it doesn't tell us what makes like cases like. So that's where we need substantive principles. So how do we get to those substantive principles? The principles that let us see when like cases are like. So I think we have to start by asking ourselves why justice matters at all. So justice matters because we do have equal moral standing. So we matter. There is not one of us that matters more than the others. We all have the same standing. Our interests and our needs matter as much as anybody else's. So that is why it matters that when we are in an equal position, we receive equally. So that's the starting point. When equal treatment upholds our fundamental equality, that is what justice requires. But Aristotle recognised that we have to look beyond equal treatment to find justice, because there are situations where, despite our moral equality, our contexts require different treatment. So we have different needs, different opportunities, different resources, different relationships. All of those things are relevant to what justice requires. So we are looking not for an idea around our moral standing, because that forms the foundation for thinking about justice at all. We are looking for those things that make a difference to vertical equity, to when there are unequal relationships. Not unequal moral standing, but when justice requires different treatment. So here is where I'm going all Italian chefy and using only the very best ingredients, the fewest ingredients to cook the dish. So what I suggest is when we're thinking about health, we need principles of distributive justice that are connected with the purpose of the allocation. So we have all these billions of dollars, common dollars that we've all put into the pot that are given to vote health. What principles should decide how those dollars are distributed? The principles should be connected with our purpose for giving that money to health. And it seems to me like that is so simple, isn't it? We fund the health system in order to meet health needs. So that's the starting point. So the difference between some candidates that determines that they get high priority and other candidates that determines that they get low priority is most fundamentally about need. It's about their health need, because that's what the health system is there for. And that's so simple. And there are many cases in which it's easy. So you smash your pelvis and I stub my toe, and we turn up at the hospital on the same day. You are suffering a lot more than me. Obviously, I'm making a bigger show of it than you are, but your need is greater than mine, so you get higher priority. So that's simple, isn't it? So need is the first cut. But unfortunately, it can't be the last cut. And I have to say, that there are other principles of distributive justice, and there are times when we have to use them. So we can also think about the role of futility, where treatment cannot serve an end. And we also have to think about cost effectiveness, and of course that's something that PharmAct does. I'm going to leave those conveniently to the side at the moment to focus on this question of need. So we've got our first cut of principles, which is we prioritise according to health need. But things get tricky, of course, because it's not like everybody presents with in different stratas of health need. So the health system is massive, it's complex, it provides a whole lot of different services, and there are many of us with health needs. So it can be the case that you might not be the only one with a smashed pelvis who rocks up to A&E that day. So maybe there's 10 of you. So then you've all got the same level of health need. How do we decide how to prioritise between you? So there we've got the strata of health need. What is our next principle? We need another principle for determining when you're all equal with need, who goes first? Now, there is a very uncontroversial starting point here, which is the duration of your need. Let's say how long you've been on the waiting list. So let's say you smashed your pelvis, I smashed my pelvis, you rocked up to hospital on Sunday, I've just rocked up today, we've got the same need, so this moment in time, we have the same need. But you have had your need for longer than me, so duration counts. So it counts because we're here to meet health needs. You've had health needs for longer, you go first. So that's not controversial, is it? We all agree with this. We all agree. Same need, had over a longer time, there's a priority there. But of course, we also know that not everybody is equally able to present themselves to healthcare, to have their health needs met. So there can be unmet needs in the community. So being on a waiting list, being present and known to the health system is a bad proxy, isn't it, for the thing that we're actually trying to tackle, which is how long you have had an unmet need for. And we know that there are patterns there. So we know this is just evidence-based. I mean, it shouldn't be controversial. We know that some communities have more obstacles in their way of meeting health needs. So when we're thinking about justice, that matters because what we're here for is to meet health needs. So the longer that you've had an unmet health need for, it just ups your priority. Now, I think that this is interesting because that is all the equity adjuster requires. The equity adjuster was simply responding to evidence that some people were waiting longer to have their health needs met. So you do not need other principles to argue for a need, an adjustment as a requirement of justice. Okay. So that takes us to the Te Poutoko Ora adjustment tool. How could we express the position on justice that tool expresses? And I think it expresses something along these lines, that we should equally prioritise equivalent health needs which are likely to have existed for similar durations. So that gets us to the point of having an argument, a solid argument for equity adjustment. So as long as what we are doing is responding to evidence that some groups do not have their health needs met in the same way, at the same level as other groups do, then we see that we need some equity adjustment in order to be faithful to this requirement to treat equals equally, treat people with equal health needs equally in the system. Okay, so the equity adjuster does not express a preference for ethnicity. It is not, it's just not a thing. It's just not what the adjuster is doing. And we can see that in a way because it wasn't just adjusting for ethnicity, but those other things got lost in the discourse. So I think that it's pretty simple to use a distributive justice principle that everyone signs up to argue for equity adjustment. But despite the simplicity of that picture, we can see from the discourse that people did not buy into this. So some people felt as though they were being treated unfairly. So they were looking at the cake being divided up and saying, how come he's getting a bigger slice? He's getting a bigger slice, even though I might have my full larder and that person may have a bare cupboard. I still see this thing here being divided up unequally. So this comes down to the kind of personal elements of distributive justice, that we experience them as people who have a vested interest. And this is a social problem that we really need to think about. How do we express the reasons that something is fair in a way that makes it compelling? And I just wanted to close up with a few words about some work that was done back in the 70s by a philosopher called John Rawls, who started off with this recognition that there is a real difficulty in seeing what justice requires, and that difficulty is that we are in the game. We are in the game and we want to protect our own interests. So it's very hard to look beyond our own interests and see what justice requires. And what John Rawls offered is a sort of thought experiment that was designed to help you see beyond your own positioning, to think about what would a just allocation look like, given that I'm self-interested, given that I want a fair amount. How do you work out what that is? He suggests you need to think about these issues, from a position of not knowing. So what he says is, imagine that you had to decide what allocation of resources you would vote for in society, but without knowing what your position was in that society. So you didn't know what talents or skills you have, what kind of family background you have, what grouping you are part of in the community and how they stand. You don't know what resources you have to start with or what kind of life you want to lead. So if you knew none of that, what allocation would you agree to? And John Rawls says, if you didn't know anything about your own positioning, you would agree to a roughly equal distribution of the primary social goods. So that's resources and opportunities, access to power. Because if we all have a roughly equal distribution, then that minimises the chances that our life is going to be a very bad life. We've got the best chance that we possibly could. But Rawls suggests that we would be particularly concerned to make sure that if we happen to be, we drew a short straw, if we happen to be in a group that was not favoured in society, that our position would be the best that it could be. So he calls this the difference principle. So he suggests what we would agree to if we didn't know where we were on the board is we would agree to an equal distribution, allowing unequal distributions only where that favours the worst off. Difference principle, or maxi-min. So that gives us a way of thinking. I'm interested to see what you think about John Rawls there. A way of thinking about what justice requires, which accepts that we are all affected by this, but asks us to look beyond our own interests. And I think, Colin, I should stop. Do you think? Kia ora.
Thank you, Monique. I take it that this is not our John Rawls of Cheryl Moana Marie fame. No, just kidding. Thank you very much. You raised some fairly deep philosophical questions that people need to think about. Fantastic presentation, Monique, yet again, so thank you. We won't ask you any questions at the moment. We'll do that following Rob's presentation. So our second presentation is from Rob Campbell. Rob is Chancellor at AUT and one of New Zealand's most respected governance leaders with over 40 years experience in economics, capital markets, public and private sector leadership. Rob holds a BA, First Class Honours, and an MPhil in economics. Began his career in the union movement and the Labour Party executive in the 70s, later transitioning to leadership roles in major organisations. Most of you will know he was the chair of Te Poutoko Ora, Health New Zealand, from its inception in 2021 until 23, and also chaired the EPA, the Environmental Protection Authority. In 2019, he was made Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit and awarded the Distinguished Alumni by Victoria University. A passionate advocate for equity, sustainability, diversity and structural change, Rob champions fairer systems from health and education to environmental and economic policy, drives innovation and emissions-lowering energy initiatives. We're fortunate to have you today. Rob asked him to speak about, perhaps with a governance bent, in terms of how do you make these sort of decisions, how do you go through this process. We're fortunate to have you, Rob. Welcome.
Thank you, Colin. It's an honour to be here. Really admire the work the Centre does and to sharing a platform with you. So Colin's genuinely. I've got used to speaking at events where I'm the person in the room that knows the least about the topic. This is another one, I'm afraid. Even on things like fairness, I realise after listening to Monique, my depth of thinking about some of the issues of fairness is probably not as deep as it should be. I've always thought that I equated fairness with pornography, in that you may not, as a law lord once said, you may not be able to define it, but you know what it is when you see it. I do feel that my approach to equity is one which is really that simplistic. We may not be able to define what is fair between people, but when we see it, we know what it is. And I'm going to try and be a bit more sophisticated about that in the future, Monique. So thank you for your guidance. And I do appreciate the opportunity to discuss this vital question of health equity, particularly for Pacific people. I've got a particular interest in this from my experience with Te Poutoko Ora. I've got a particular interest from my role as Chancellor at what Damon Saleza instructed me to call Aotearoa's largest tertiary educator for health professionals, which indeed we are. I hasten to say I'm not talking on behalf of AUT here, these are personal views, but mostly just as a person living in Tāmaki Makaurau, where Pacific people make up such a significant proportion of the population in every sense. I'm not going to go into and rehearse the many inequities in health outcomes for Pasifika peoples living in Aotearoa. Nor am I going to focus on the importance of these people and the inequities they experience numerically, economically or socially, not only in Aotearoa but across Moana Nui a Kiwa. These are all well known. They are not hidden. And it's all the more shameful for the fact that they are well known, not hidden. Sometimes, you know, simple repetition of deficits numbs the senses. It acclimatises us to injustices, blinds us to solutions. We develop, and I told Monique I was going to use this phrase, we developed a learned helplessness. which hold us back from seeing what we should be doing simply by repeating the facts again and again that are well known. Instead, what I want to do is to not have yet another analysis of the many things which are wrong, which reflect deficits or failures, or the incremental funding, training and service delivery adjustments which flow from that sort of approach, no matter how grudging and inadequate they may be. We simply will not solve these issues of equity by tinkering with the system or tweaking its processes. So in my contribution today, I want to turn that approach, the traditional approach to discussion of health inequities, on its head. I think we've got our whole approach to health so wrong that a complete reversal of our thinking and action on health is required, particularly when it comes to the inequities facing Pasifika people in this country. What if we took an approach which started from the actual people in the actual location we're in and asked ourselves, what would a healthy approach to health look like? I do this with particular reference to Pacific peoples, putting them at the centre, appropriate when you're in a Fale after all. But I do say from the start that the implications of this to me are vastly positive for all the other peoples that are here as well. First, we should stop thinking about a health system as being about New Zealand. That colonial state nomenclature itself carries with it too much implication of hierarchy, injustice and cultural blindness. We will not find our way to a healthy health system from that state. We will end up with a copy of other imperial or colonial states which all display exactly the same inevitable injustices to Indigenous people or migrant people or low-income people. Maybe let's just be frank and call them brown people, populations around the world. It is frankly ridiculous when you reflect on it to expect that any healthy health system for the many populations in this place could be created from the vision, tools and practices of such a state. It was never designed for such a purposes. What we call the state of New Zealand was never designed to deliver justice to Pacific peoples. No one ever thought it was. Why would we expect that it does today? It doesn't make any sense. It will not even be enough, to substitute a name such as Aotearoa as our place. I think it's preferable because it does, through Te Tiriti, include the Indigenous peoples and their ways in some way. But again, we know the differences between various hapu and iwi, between Te Ika o Maui and Te Waiponamu, are real, as are the real differences between the many migrant and other tauiwi populations in this place. These cannot be brushed aside or obscured into an homogenous form to suit colonial administration practice without great harm to the health of the existing health system. We don't live in Europe. I'm going to say some pretty obvious things here today. We don't live in Europe. And we are not islands to ourselves. The most natural and healthy way to locate how we think of ourselves, to me, is as part of Oceania. Once we do that, think about it, once we do that, once we say where we are located is not in this state called New Zealand, which we're located in a place called Oceania, immediately Pacific peoples, their health and the health of their islands are not something external, but an integral part of what, where, and how we live. Not a minority, not an addition or a marginal group, but an intrinsic part of the whole. Even the centre of the whole, if you consider the geography and history of this vast continent of water and islands holistically. You can see immediately why it makes no sense to have a health system that somehow Pacific people are marginalised or external to or prevented from. Can't get to a healthy health system that way. And it tells you immediately that the health of the whenua of our many islands, all part of that same great ocean, and the health of the peoples of those islands are intrinsically linked to each other across the great ocean. And you can import as many palangi and their laws and practices as you like. That will bring many positive and many challenging things, but you will not change that crucial fact about Oceania. It is the underlying fact of all of our health. So we must start with recognising the essentiality of health as being about the health of our place, our whenua, our moana, our awa. Start to imagine a health system which placed that at its core. It's very hard to work back from our current state to such a healthy space. So hard that we can really only imagine working forward from such a state and must prioritise it, not treat it as an optional extra, which might result from greater material extraction, production and private wealth, but very likely won't. Our natural resources as part of this Oceania are a treasure, a tauranga, which is part of our being, not something to be bought and sold, extracted and exported, but a living being of which we are part. A healthy health system starts there, doesn't start at all. When we proceed from health at that foundational level, we can readily see that the next level of health is about how we live. Healthy nutrition and hydration, healthy homes and clothing, healthy work and play. It makes no sense to expect or encourage human health after taking no steps to protect and nurture it. View health services like a repair shop at a demolition derby. The way we treat it now. So that second step of healthy people, a healthy health service, is the provision, promotion and protection of healthy people living healthy lives. Sounds kind of something like a public health system. Is the second essential foundation, not as an optional extra, but using the knowledge we have about health rather than ignoring it until something goes wrong. What a radical idea if you look back from where we are now. It's simply logical, practical, if you look at it from the right base. From this standpoint of healthy public health systems, we would then, I think, surely recognise that when health is nevertheless threatened by accident, genetics, age or some other causes, age is prominent in most of you, we must recognise and respond to that and do so in the most accessible pace and process that there is, that we can find. Sounds like prioritising primary care as the third foundation of health. Not as a good or service to be bought and sold in a private market, but as a genuine public service, available to all, based on health need, not capacity to pay. Not as an optional extra, as I keep saying, but as a right, a part of the foundation of a healthy health system. We would prioritise universal availability of what health services were needed as an essential part of life, not as a cost centre, one to be minimised, rather an opportunity to maximise our health as communities in Oceania. Now we know, being realists in this world, I'm imagining and not free market dreamers, that we will still wish to have hospital level care, procedures and technologies in this world. So it will be for many fewer people than we currently need, given that we've approached the foundational aspects of our health system in the right way. We would not need to and would not dream of, in a healthy world, treating this as a luxury. See it as a service which flowed naturally from our healthy communities and was something we shared with pride and aroha, not simply as a cost centre grudgingly provided. The only envy involved would be the envy of those who had not built their health system on the healthy foundations that we have. We have, by taking this approach, inverted how we think and act about health. This is exactly the inverse of our current health system. We've eliminated many of the myriad obstacles to equity and health outcomes. We will have, in fact, built distributive justice into our health service system. Now, the fact that we don't have this now is the result of directly thinking about it in an irrational way. We have an ill health system, a system which favours treatment over protection and promotion of health, which treats health services as a commodity and its provision as a transaction. On this view, health is not about scarce resources and their allocation, which was my economics training, not about scarce resources and their allocation to how we repair unhealthy lives in an unhealthy environment. Everything we do now, health services, feeds those ideas. How do we deal with ill health in an unhealthy environment? And it's obvious that increasingly private provision will seem like the answer, the inevitable outcome of this, because we have structured it around a service delivery which is a transaction, and who's better at doing transactions than private providers? The ideology says that private markets most efficiently allocate scarce resources across competing demands. No more reason to expect equity from a health system built on that ideology than there is from any other market, which is why we need to invert it. Now, we know that inequity abounds in the current health system. We know that Pacific people are amongst those most disadvantaged. In this beautiful city, we live in the governments, not just the current government, which purport to represent us, neither genuinely recognise nor seek to combat this inequity and others like it. 1 in 4 babies born in Tāmaki, Pacific, deserve a healthy health system. To get it, we've got to turn the priorities on their head. Unfortunately, I've got no expectations that either the current or any of the most likely alternative combinations will embrace such a radical shift. Recognition of how much this shift is necessary to achieve a healthy health service system will develop slowly, and it will develop from the bottom up, from communities adversely affected by the current approach, not from the health bureaucracy and others. We have to recognise who benefit from the current approach. Too often forget that while we may think of health services as being too poorly resourced and with many staff paid too little, that is by no means the full truth of our health service system. The dominant story of our health services is one of wealth accumulation. Pharmacy, medical devices, health properties, and even service deliveries, where private equity increasingly sees and takes many opportunities. Much more the reality of our health service than the poor parts of it that we see. They won't let go easily. So the future is in the hands of those who are fighting to go back to the start, who are fighting for the health of our whenua, moana and awa, who are fighting for economic and political power to be exercised by marginalised communities that are not marginal, such as Pacific peoples, here and throughout Oceania, fighting to establish health services grounded in their own community. The real shame of the Paora legislation, which underpinned Te Poutoko Ora, was not its aims of health equity, but its failure to adequately recognise that the foundations described in this talk today as the primary drivers of community health and its naive reliance on the institutions of the old system to deliver the new. Never. Te Ora was a tentative step in the right direction. So were the iwi Māori partnership boards. Potential to exercise mana motohaki and health services was glimpsed, briefly then taken away. Pacific People's Health was never given the same recognition and independence, didn't even really get the glimpse. It should have been, but the mean arithmetic of the balance sheet, ballot box, overcame the logic and heart of who we really are, where we live, and what our potentials are. We are treated as workers and consumers in a make-believe world where dollars mean more than ourselves. Apart from some occasional nods to diversity, nods which are increasingly being truncated or withdrawn, we're subject to what the Reverend Professor Upolu Lumā Vaai described in a talanora I was with this past week as wanification, another good word. Wanification, that is everything, no matter how diverse they are, must dissolve into one reality. He said it denies people their difference and cultural integrity by maintaining the legitimacy of only one story, one language, one culture, one way, and one frame of reference. He opposed this to the Pacific approach of relationality and of a vā which embodied both unity and connection and contradiction. Reality which might be complex, but is more in accord with reality than the fantasy that everything can be treated as a dollar. This does not really work for anything much. It certainly doesn't work for a healthy health system. The Reverend Professor has seen that, at least for some forms of activity, such as education. People in the Pacific must create their own islands of practice wherever they are in the vast ocean, stand on the cultural values they have inherited from their tupuna, and see a vital application of that to health services too. So to conclude, it's no use asking the institutions of the old world, the colonial, the dollarised, homogenised world, to lead or make the changes we need. That work, that right, that historical obligation rests on those experiencing inequity. Bob Marley put it, none but ourselves can free our minds. Challenge together.
Thank you very much, Rob. A lot to think about. Can I ask you both to come to the front? Unfortunately, the folk online, you can't ask any questions, but you and the Fale can, and there are microphones around. Both Monique and Rob have raised some fairly big challenges for us all. As you are thinking about your questions, I'll start. One for you, Rob. Some would say we're in too deep, too far gone, too far down the road, and the idea that it'll be built up from the bottom along what you prescribe, which I think you're absolutely right. In other words, the idea is a good one. The execution will be challenging. And disappointing to also point out that as a country, we spend peanuts, the foundation. You will all have seen the troubles we have had with primary care, and people keep wondering, why do the emergency departments fill up so quickly? And I think less than, it's 3 or 4% on health promotion, prevention. How do we turn it around, Rob?
You're right, of course, Colin. What I would say, though, is I think there's a tendency amongst many of us who are concerned about inequity in Oceania to think that it's gone a long way. I think it's got a lot further to go, which increases the urgency. I think that in health, for example, privatisation of health and reliance on private insurance is at a very early stage, not at a late stage. A lot further to go, and with it, I fear inequity's got a long way to go. So we can't counterpose what we have now to what we have to create. I think what we have now is on its way to getting worse, as are the environmental and housing and population health issues that are around. To me, I think that we need to recognise that reversal I've talked about. It will take time to show through in practice, but we could start reversing at least parts of it quite quickly, in my view, and I would start at the foundational elements. I think we have to accept that we have a very broken health system, as we like to think of it, and we're probably going to come to that last. It's probably going to be quite bad for quite some time until we construct, very simplistically called environmental practices, public health practices, and others. I think that's where we actually have to start and accept that our hospital services and even our primary care services are going to be very suboptimal for a long time. I'm not an optimist about that. I think you have to believe that the change will come, but yeah, I think it has to start at the foundational elements rather than at the health system, because otherwise we can just spend years playing around with the health system and not achieve a result.
I like your reference to don't ask the existing institutions to do something different. I think you're absolutely right. Monique, it's often not about the 10 people with the fractured pelvis. It is actually, back to your first point, it's actually the stub toe in a privileged group versus the fractured pelvis in the brown people. If you excuse my, it was Rob who used the, let me put it back to you that it's actually not so much about 10 pelvises, but yeah, stub toe in a privileged individual versus the fractured pelvis in a brown person. It's, what do you make of that challenge? Because I think it's actually for a significant part of it, it's actually about that.
I see a difficulty for doctors in this, because, you know, doctors are trained to meet the health needs that present. And I think we have to consider when we're training doctors, you know, where these obligations around distributive justice lie. You know, where in the system, and I guess that takes us back to Rob's point about the system. You know, how is the system structured in a way that identifies and responds to these questions of distributive justice, because it tends to take every individual as it comes and not see the pattern. And I guess one risk here is that we may not even collect the data that allows us to see the patterns. So, I mean, part of it, you know, health researchers have a really important role in terms of shining a light on where the injustice is. But what's less clear to me is where in the system the responsibility for seeing those larger health needs and responding to them is, given the transactional nature of I come in, I've got a stubbed toe, it's your job to do something about my stubbed toe. It's a challenge, isn't it?
I think, Colin, if I could, I get really frustrated with the way the current government's approach, and the previous government wasn't much better in my opinion, but is sort of called the rat. They think they're being rational. I think we underestimate how irrational behaviour in this current health system is. I recall when I was in Te Poutoko Ora, we went up to Whangarei because the minister wanted to make an announcement about a new hospital building. And we were a bit delayed at the start. Andrew Little and I were standing there, and I said to him, this development we're going to do here is going to cost $1 billion, give or take. And I said, if you took all the health problems we can observe in Te Poutoko Ora and said, I've got $1 billion, try and deal with them, would you build a hospital here? And his answer was, of course not. And yet that's what we were doing. We were locked into a process of spending $1 billion in what the minister knew wasn't a sensible way to allocate that $1 billion. It's quite extraordinary, you know. And a much smaller example, only a couple of months ago when the government was announcing some plans to stop giving Māori men, I think it was in their 50s, bowel cancer checks. I'm in my mid-70s, so I get a message from the Ministry of Health, Te Poutoko Ora, saying it's time for my bowel cancer check and please do it. I'm 75 with no problems. The chance I might well die with bowel cancer, the chances of me dying of bowel cancer are quite low. And here were men with young families being denied access who had a real health problem. What on earth were they wasting their time on me? I could have gone down the road and bought one if I wanted one. Again, we forget how irrational the decisions that this system is making are. There's just countless decisions being made every day in our health system that simply don't make any sense if you think about it from the viewpoint of a healthy health system.
Thank you, Rob. Questions from the floor, Rob?
A question for you, Monique. I think there's another problem here, and it's around the cake and how big your piece is. And, you know, Rawls' idea of this sort of naive person who doesn't understand that they could have a bigger piece of cake and their life would be better, and that if that was the case, then they'd be okay with this idea of everybody having equal sized pieces. Now, my sister figured out very quickly that she could steal my cake and that she would live a better life. And I think people very quickly realised that. And one thing I realised sort of having a son at school is that a lot of parents, when I've raised issues of equity among the school parents, I get this comment back, what's this fairness nonsense that you're talking about? You know, I think there's been this real conspiracy fed around this idea that, you know, this idea of fairness is a conspiracy to undermine, you know, our capitalist world, maybe. So, you know, do you think that's a major problem with trying to address this?
Yeah, I mean, the moral psychology of distributive justice is very interesting, isn't it? And you're right, I mean, Rawls is not going to, that little thought experiment is not going to take the scales from people's eyes and transform the way they think. I guess I think about those experiments as helpful for people who do have roles in distributing resources, because I think it's very, very easy to feel pulled in different directions and lose sight of where's north, like what makes this fair. And I think that gives you a sense that there is a place beyond the kind of competition for, the most that you can get, where that the ideal of equality is the thing that matters, and the way to get there is through compensating through for the non-ideal world that we live in. But you're right, it's not going to all go away. And I mean, it's an interesting point that you make about how fairness can be seen. I mean, there's these levels of distribution, aren't there? And we can see we live in a world where some people are allowed to accumulate obscene amounts of wealth and powers. They get powers because they have wealth. I mean, there is just this snowballing, this absurd snowballing, and it feels very, very hard to unpick that. So to try to find something fair on top of that, I mean, it is like a slippery slope, isn't it? It's almost like how corruption works. Yeah, so we have a real challenge as a country, don't we? To try to keep invested in the game. And the more that things are privatised and left for individuals, I mean, this week we've had that kind of discussion about what will happen with climate change and some areas being uninhabitable anymore, and the idea that will be left for individuals. The individualisation of risk, it only feeds, well, I have to make sure my slice is enough.
Renee Liang, paediatrician and longitudinal researcher. So my question actually addresses the title of this, which is Distributive Justice in Health. And the question relates to where does health end and other things begin? Because I guess, Rob, you definitely sort of keyed us into the idea that actually health begins in the environment, and also, the social determinants of health, which your key addressed, also encompasses things like education, housing, access to, jobs. So all of these things we know are actually part of health. And yet, as doctors, we are constantly told, stay in your lane, do your job, fix the stub toe, and then that's you done for the day, instead of advocating. So I guess my question is, how do you determine where health ends, and do you have any tips for talking to people about that? Because I'm guessing that the idea of distributive justice is very wide, right? And you have, that idea of how do you even begin to address that subject?
I skipped the question of the distributive part of justice because I was too scared to question Colin on it. But from my point of view, just saying to Monique earlier on, there were no Marxists left in universities, and I'm not really a Marxist, or no Marxist would think it was, but I think distributive justice and distributive things largely follow production and reproduction, how we produce goods and services, and how we reproduce ourselves in our families and in our communities and in our societies. So those material things of how we produce and reproduce our lives, not just in the family sense, but in the broader sense, determine a lot of what distributive justice is. So I think unless you deal with those quite concrete things about how we live our lives and where we live our lives and all of those things, that trying to deal simply with the distributive end of it is a fool's errand in a way, because you'll keep having the inequities being reproduced in order to try and deal with them. So that's why I didn't have Colin on about it. I thought I'll just ignore it and try and get away with it.
Renee's question. I'm the referee here, and you guys are... You don't ask the questions, I do. We'll take... let me think about this. We'll take a question from the gentleman.
Kia ora, good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. Question for the economist and the two doctors. To the economist, sir, you spoke about this being a market economy. There are advocates of it who will say, well, private insurance is the viable option going forward. The reason being, private insurance can only be afforded by people who can pay for it. That clears the public sector or the public hospitals for people who cannot afford it. How do you respond to that? To the two doctors there, what I have said is a broad generalization, I accept that. But in your experience working in the research sector and in the public health sector and the face of it, is my generalization acceptable, or is it?
I think one of the real problems of our current health system is that it does work very well for about half of the people in the country. It's not that it doesn't work well for everyone, because it does for, call it half, roundabout. And that's partly because of private insurance, also partly just because of the sort of reasons that were touched on by Monique, of the various reasons you might get access more quickly, just cultural and social and other things. So that takes a sense of urgency away from it. And so insurance can solve some of the issues, and it's possible to imagine that this system might evolve to one in which even a form of social insurance is adopted for healthcare, which becomes kind of compulsory, that everyone has to pay insurance, and it'll still be laddered and hierarchical and inequitable, but I think they'll eventually find ways to... We're already finding ways. I mean, everyone loves KiwiSaver at the moment, but if you think about it, it's simply a means of privatising provision of superannuation. It's making workers pay for their retirement income rather than society paying for it. And I think the same thing probably will start to happen increasingly for health, but it will still be laddered and hierarchical, and it will still be feeding a transactional system, which is based on people being able to sell things to that insurance group, which will keep on escalating costs and skew the provision. So I sound like a real doom merchant today, I'm sorry, but that's my reaction to what you say, I think.
I'm very interested in these questions around insurance and how they actually affect distribution. And from what I understand, we just don't have evidence of the effect that private insurance has on availability of health care. I mean, I think you're dead right. I think that people get insurance if they can, and they say, it's rationalised, so I can afford it, and it means that other people who aren't able to afford it will be able to take my spot, is the idea, isn't it? I'm releasing capacity, which is interesting, because it's not like most of us have a bed, like with our name on it, just waiting for us. But we have this idea that we're releasing capacity. And it seems to me like the real picture is much more messy than that, because of all of the ways in which clinicians work across the public and the private system, and the way that waiting lists work, and differences around complexity, what insurance will cover and won't cover, and what is left for the public system to deal with, and how that affects throughput. So I think that we actually need some research about this. It's quite a complex system. but there are researchers who do this kind of systems work. I suspect we're kidding ourselves when we think that we're contributing to the public good by opting out, and we can see now the way that might be contributing to a discourse which allows more privatisation in, and it might be very hard to get back to a much more fully public provision.
Thanks, Monique. We'll take one more question, if there is any. Kara, yeah, well, one over here.
For the talk. I was curious about the definition that you had, Monique, about justice, especially in the area of health, given that a lot of the historical injustices of our health, where our health stats sit for Pacific and Māori people, it makes me think about, bringing justice in a legal sense with the health systems, because, a lot of the health systems are broken and they've been based on really racist foundations. So, like, bringing legal justice, like an inquiry almost, to the health system to advocate for our people and to almost prove, bringing evidence to society to say, hey, our people have been treated unfairly for such a long time and we're in this position because of historical injustices. I just want to see what your thoughts are.
Oh, thank you for that. So those were themes that I was thinking about as I was writing this talk. If we'd had more time, I'd like to unpack that because, firstly, Y2575 and those processes, I guess they're a way of doing that. And I see, so justice is a much wider thing than distributive justice. As Sir Colin said, there's social justice. And I think that you're talking about almost like reparative justice, restorative justice, which involves taking responsibility for the harm that you have done and making it right. And I'm really interested in how restorative justice intersects with distributive justice. So I tried to keep things simple and just based upon need, but I think that this is something we really need to grapple with. So we as a society have enabled there to be some groups that inherit privilege and other groups that inherit a lot of trauma and harm. And that was avoidable. So, that's the result of things we can point to. And when you've harmed someone, we teach our children, don't we? It's not, firstly, you do have to say sorry. And secondly, that's not enough. You have to make it right. So you have to repair the injury and you also have to not do it again. Those things apply at a social level, don't they? And it comes to collective agency. Issues around responsibility and collective agency are really complex. And so I can't give you an easy answer, but I agree with you that there is a particular imperative to address harms that are expressed as inequities in health and health outcomes because they are the result of the things that we collectively have done and have allowed to be done. Yeah.
We'll take one more
from Oh, thank you. I'm an obstetrician gynecologist, and I've been working in the hospital system for a long time. My question, Rob Campbell, is around if you look at the big hospitals, even the ones where there's a lot of inequities in health, but the people in the decision-making level is never Pacific or Māori or the people where the inequities are happening. Do you think there'll be any possibility at any stage that they will look into that? Because there's never any drive to really look at the populations that are impacted, because the people at the top who are making the decisions about where the money goes is probably going into robotics, where the big boys play, and, you know, laparoscopically. Do you know what I mean? And the distribution of the wealth or the amount of money is to have the big toys to play the big games, and not necessarily to improve the health of the populations that are hugely impacted by the inequity distribution of the funding, say, for example. It was just a question that I've always had.
Could I agree with the direction of what you're saying. One of the interesting things in my Te Poutoko Ora experience was the process of localities which has been abandoned, and there's a widespread view that the localities concept was wrong. My view is that it wasn't wrong, it just was never taken far enough. In fact, many of the localities were loosely formed of people working in the community members with some health professionals, but with quite strong local people's input. And it was remarkable that around the country, how often the localities' plans were similar in terms of what they prioritised, and how much they differed. They were almost the inverse of what the health plan of the government was. The allocations were so different, it was extraordinary. And I think one of the reasons they were abandoned is that, having consulted local communities about health needs, the answers were not what they wanted to hear. And I think it's one of the main reasons the localities were abandoned. And there's no question the same thing is happening with the iwi Māori partnership boards, which are still in existence, but are having their funding and authority truncated as time goes on. Again, those in authority don't want to hear what they're being told by iwi and hapu around the country as to what the changes should be, which is really quite shameful. But I think reflects what I think you were saying, that those inequities which are deeply embedded are known, they are understood, but the people in charge just don't want to hear them.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks very much, everyone. Our time is up, so I'll just ask you, Rob, if you want to make any final comment, and Monique, and then I'll wind this up for us. Thank you.
I've had more than a fair go, thanks, Colin.
Okay. Monique?
Yeah, I feel like, you know, my slice of the cake has already been too big.
Firstly, what did I do? The only question I want to respond to is the one from Renee. Where does health end? If you look at Māori providers, primary care providers, community and Pacific, there is no end. You know, it transitions into social issues, to employment issues, to housing. There's a Pacific provider that I'm particularly fond of. They do all of the clinical care and the support. And in fact, they're successfully running apprentices training for young people. In other words, it's, I think, a frame of mind. The traditional, conventional delivery is clinical, and nothing wrong with that. But if you look at, it's kind of the model that Rob was talking about. This is much more inclusive of the determinants of health and empowerment of people. Is only the only thing I want to respond to. But can I just say thank you to Rob Campbell and to Monique Jonas for a really deep, difficult, challenging conversation. Plenty to think about. I still like my idea of the example, Monique, is the privileged individual with a stubbed toe and the brown person with a smashed pelvis. I still think that's the example I'm going to keep reminding you about. But look, this has been fantastic, and for coming along, we're going to give you a cup of tea after this. But can I just ask you all to show our appreciation to Mr. Rob Campbell? And Monique, thank you so much for today, and to you all for joining us and giving up your time. Thank you very much. We hope it's been a useful learning opportunity and experience for you all. Thanks very much. Oh, and do join us for some lunch and a cup of tea.